Before proceeding, viewers are advised to exercise caution. The following is intended for educational and entertainment purposes only. This is a verbatim reproduction of testimony in federal court in the case of Sean Diddy Combs, as reported by Inner City Press. In the large, bright courtroom, where a high-profile case involving renowned producer Sean Diddy Combs had been underway for some time, an almost complete silence suddenly fell. Everyone present froze in anticipation, and then, unexpectedly, the judge uttered a new name: Jada Pinkett Smith. For many in the courtroom, it came as a bolt from the blue, as she had not been connected to the trial in any way until that moment. Jada Pinkett Smith is not just an actress known for her many successful films and TV series. She is also the wife of world-famous actor Will Smith and a highly successful businesswoman in her own right. When her name was announced, a tense atmosphere hung in the room. Jada took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts, and stood up to speak. Everyone understood that she was about to reveal something very important, a story she had kept hidden for almost 20 years and had finally decided to share with the world. Jada continued her story, delving into the details of that strange and tense meeting. She explained that it all started quite formally. She received a call on behalf of Diddy saying that he was interested in working together on several social and charitable initiatives. He had allegedly been following her activism for a long time, knew that she was passionate about issues of equality and youth support, and wanted to join forces in the music industry to launch a major project with a social message. Jada found the idea interesting and agreed to a personal meeting. But when she arrived at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel, it didn't look like a business meeting at all. In the lobby, she was told that the meeting would not take place in a conference room or restaurant, but in a private suite, which made her a little wary. Nevertheless, she went up to the room. Diddy himself opened the door. He was dressed all in white, a white shirt, white pants, even his slippers were white. The room was unusually quiet. No aides, no assistants, just him alone. A soft jazz melody played in the corner. The light was soft and subdued, creating the feeling of not a business meeting, but something more like a private, almost meditative conversation. Diddy warmly offered her some champagne. He handed her a glass with the confidence of someone who was used to being in control, but Jada immediately felt out of place. She politely declined, saying that she preferred to remain sober during business discussions. Even then, she sensed that the atmosphere in the room was not just strange, but artificially constructed. It was as if everything had been planned in advance: the clothes, the music, the lighting. After a while, Diddy walked over to the bar, took out a leather folder, placed it neatly on the table, and pulled out a thick stack of papers. The title page read, "Loyalty Agreement." He didn't explain anything, he just handed her the document and looked at her silently. Jada, confused, began to flip through the pages. Everything was written in legal language. Point by point, the obligations of the parties were spelled out, along with a prohibition on disclosing any information about private meetings, conversations, or any nature of their interaction. At first, she thought it was someone's joke. The document was so unusual that she didn't even realize right away that this was serious. To lighten the mood, she tried to joke. She said, "Is this hip-hop Scientology?" Meaning that the document resembled the rules of some kind of secret sect or club. But Diddy didn't laugh, he didn't even smile. He nodded and said in all seriousness that this document was their mutual insurance policy. That in show business, everyone knows everything, but no one says anything. And that if people want to feel safe, they need to agree on the rules of silence in advance. At that moment, according to Jada, she realized that she hadn't come for a conversation about charity. She felt that all of this was part of some hidden system with unspoken rules, intimidation, and control. Jada picked up the document, still hoping that it might be some kind of unusual way of signing a contract, as sometimes happens in the world of show business. But the more she read, the more she realized that this was something completely different. It was not an official contract in the usual form. There were no law firm logos, no seals, no standard wording about the parties' liability or terms. It looked like a kind of manifesto, handwritten by someone with a rather peculiar way of thinking. She was particularly struck by the confidentiality requirements. And not just that she couldn't share details of the meeting or talk about their interaction with Diddy. The document used extremely unusual wording. For example, it said that silence was required not only during life but also after death, followed by the phrase, "including during spiritual transitions." Jada admitted that at first she didn't even understand what that meant. She asked herself, Is he talking about life after death? Or some kind of religious or esoteric teaching? The text also contained a strict warning. No information from the so-called sacred place, whatever that meant, should be disclosed. Not in court, not in church, not in the media, not in private conversations. The word sacred was repeated constantly, but there was no explanation of what place was being referred to. It felt like it was part of some kind of closed system or organization with its own code. It got worse. There were some really scary phrases. The document talked about the need to submit to the higher good of the legacy. The wording itself wasn't just weird. It sounded like something you'd hear from a totalitarian cult. There were mysterious references to rituals, initiations, and even punishment for betrayal. A certain structure was described, like a hierarchy of secrecy, where access to information was only granted to those who had passed a demonstration of loyalty. What exactly this demonstration entailed was not specified. There were also repeated references to tests, but no mention of what these tests were, how they were conducted, or who administered them. The word meetings also appeared, in a context that suggested these were not ordinary gatherings, but some kind of closed events requiring special permission to attend. But the strangest concept was selection. This word was repeated several times, always in an alarming, out-of-context manner, as if it meant something important but was deliberately left undefined. Who or what was included in this selection remained a mystery. Reading all this, Jada felt a chill run down her spine. It was as if someone was trying to drag her into something that had nothing to do with why she had come here. She was not holding a cooperation agreement in her hands, but an invitation to a dark and possibly dangerous world, with its own laws that were incomprehensible to outsiders. When Jada reached the last page of the strange document, she noticed something that completely threw her off balance. At the bottom, where the signature was usually placed, her name was already written. Printed. Clearly, using the same font that imitated a real signature. It looked as if the contract had been drawn up in advance as an official document, with the expectation that she would not read it, would not ask any questions, but would simply tick the box and leave. It was not an offer. It looked like a trap. Jada's heart sank. She felt like she wasn't a guest at a business meeting, but a participant in some kind of ritual that she was being drawn into without her knowledge. Everything that was happening no longer seemed random. The dim lighting, Diddy's white clothes, the jazz music, the absence of other people. It all looked like a carefully rehearsed scene, and now she understood that she was at the center of this spectacle. Jada calmly but firmly refused to sign the document. She simply said no and put the papers back on the table. And then, according to her, the atmosphere in the room changed dramatically. The music that had been playing softly throughout the meeting suddenly stopped. An oppressive silence fell. Diddy's face, which had been relaxed and almost friendly, became hard and tense. He leaned slowly toward her and, barely moving his lips, said quietly, "You'll regret this in your next life." His voice was even, without emotion, but that was what made the phrase so frightening. For a second, Jada didn't understand. Was it a threat? Or was he talking about some kind of karmic punishment, as if he believed in reincarnation? Or was it part of that strange cult the document had hinted at? She left the room immediately, without looking back. Many years have passed since then, but the feeling that she had almost become part of something dark, hidden, and vast has never left her. All this time, she has remained silent because she felt that what happened in that room was not just a strange incident. It was part of something much deeper and more dangerous. After that meeting at the hotel, Jada decided to remain silent. Not because she had nothing to say, but because she realized that the consequences could be too serious. Not only for herself, but also for her family, her colleagues, and those who were in one way or another connected to the industry. Her words conveyed a sense of fear, not of a single threat, but of the system, something bigger than one person. She began to notice strange behavior in other women connected to Diddy in one way or another. Some seemed to suddenly disappear from the tabloids, projects, and interviews. They seemed to dissolve, fade into the shadows without explanation. Others remained, but there was something wary about them, in their eyes, their speech, their attempts to avoid certain topics. It was as if they had invisible obligations, something that prevented them from speaking freely. Jada sensed this almost intuitively. As an actress, and as someone who had lived in the spotlight for many years and knew when someone was acting and when they were trying not to show their fear. Over time, fear became part of her everyday life. Nightmares began, recurring dreams in which she found herself in the same hotel room, in the same dim light, hearing the same words. Sometimes she woke up with the feeling that someone was standing by her bed, watching her. Sometimes she felt like she was being followed on the street. The same faces flashing by in the crowd. Strange cars slowly driving past her house. She also started receiving calls from unknown numbers. Often there was silence on the other end. Sometimes there was a mechanical voice or just a short beep, after which the line would go dead. At first, she tried to find rational explanations, but the more it happened, the more she felt that it wasn't paranoia, but that someone was really trying to get her attention. To cope with this, Jada started keeping a diary. She wrote down everything: her dreams, her suspicions, her feelings. It was her attempt to structure her fear, to make it at least a little bit controllable. But over time, the fear that someone might read these entries proved stronger. She was afraid that if someone gained access to these entries, it could hurt more than just her. At one point, she simply burned the diary, page by page, as if destroying not just paper, but the very possibility that the truth would come out. And then she truly shut herself off. Jada kept silent all those years, and only now, almost 2 decades later, did she feel that the time had come to speak out. For a long time, Jada didn't even share this story with her husband. Not because she didn't trust him, but because she was afraid that it would sound too crazy. Like a story about some cult conspiracy that she had stumbled into by some ridiculous accident. She was afraid that people would think she was paranoid. That they would say, "Are you seriously thinking that you're being followed? That it was some kind of secret ritual?" Even she herself tried to blame it all on her imagination, on stress, on the fact that she had lived too many years in a world where the truth is often hidden behind expensive suits and smiles. But everything changed when the trial began. One after another, women began to testify, describing frighteningly similar experiences. They also told of strange encounters, proposals that began as business deals and ended with mysterious agreements. Some spoke of contracts that contained references to sacrifice, higher powers, and even reincarnation. Some mentioned threats, not always direct, but clearly sinister. Many had the same feeling, as if they were being drawn into something from which it would be impossible to escape. And then Jada realized she wasn't alone. Everything she thought was just her imagination turned out to be part of a bigger picture. These things that seemed too absurd to be true were actually real. Others had similar stories, similar words, similar fears. It was incredibly difficult to decide to speak out. It meant reliving that night, remembering how trapped she felt. It meant coming under the media spotlight, being in the headlines again, but this time not as an actress, but as a woman who had broken her silence. It meant possibly feeling that same chill down her spine again, that same gaze that seemed to follow her even in her own home. But Jada made a choice. Because with each passing day, she understood more clearly that her silence did not protect her. It protected those who did this to her again and again. And if she wanted it to stop, the truth had to be told. Let it be painful, let it be scary, but she was no longer going to be part of someone else's game. After Jada decided to tell her story, the case instantly reached a new level. What at first looked like a personal confession quickly turned into a full-blown scandal, with new details emerging all the time. The initial emotional outburst was followed by a barrage of accusations. 2 new loyalty agreements were submitted to the court, discovered during the investigation of Diddy's former employees and partners. And these documents were not just similar to the one Jada described, they almost verbatim repeated its frightening wording. The first agreement was provided by a former assistant to the producer. According to her, she received the same leather folder in 2007 when she first started working on his team. At the time, it was presented as a kind of internal code, a symbol of trust and loyalty. She recalled that the signing ceremony took place in a strange, almost ritualistic setting. Candles, white clothing, dim lighting, and no phones. The atmosphere was more like a cult ceremony than a corporate meeting. The second document was handed over by a former dancer who participated in Diddy's world tour in 2010. She also received an offer to sign a contract, and, according to her, refusal could have had life-threatening consequences. Frightened, she signed without reading the details and later tried to break away from this environment as quickly as possible and simply disappear from view. Despite differences in design, one document looked like a simple printout, The other was styled as a presentation brochure. Their content was almost identical. Both agreements included a commitment to maintain silence even after death, with references to spiritual transitions and energetic silence. They also spoke of lifelong loyalty to the mission, which goes beyond the physical body and time frames. There were also threats in case of breach of the agreement. Strange phrases such as energy expulsion and karmic reset. In addition, there were abstract but ominous phrases about sacrifices for the common good, the highest legacy, and stages of initiation. All these details only reinforced the suspicions. What Jada was saying was not a figment of her imagination or emotional exaggeration. On the contrary, her story turned out to be the key to understanding how everything really worked. It was not just a strange meeting in a hotel, but part of a much broader and deeply rooted system. And now, with the material evidence before the court, it was clear that something much darker lurked behind the glossy facade of the industry. When the 3 loyalty agreements discovered during the investigation were handed to the jury, a heavy, tense silence fell over the courtroom. People in the courtroom watched their reactions closely, and they spoke for themselves. The jurors ran their fingers skeptically over the pages, reading aloud frightening phrases such as loyalty after death and punishment for betrayal. Then compared the texts again and again, as if unable to believe that 3 independent women could have brought in virtually identical documents without knowing about each other. The similarity between them was not just striking, it was almost mirror-like. It did not look like a coincidence, but rather part of a clearly defined system. But what happened next had perhaps the strongest effect. An independent handwriting expert was called to court. One of those who are usually invited in particularly sensitive cases. He was given 3 copies, the document that Jada had told him about, as well as the papers from the former assistant and dancer. The expert reported that he had carefully examined all the handwritten elements on these sheets, underlining of individual phrases, small notes in the margins, and especially one symbol that appeared on all 3 copies. It was a stylized drawing of an eye inscribed in a circle. Although it looked almost like a decorative squiggle, for the expert it was a key element. The expert came to an unequivocal conclusion. All the handwritten notes and symbols were made by the same person. He noted that the slant, pressure, structure of the letters, and even the manner of underlining all correspond to Sean Combs' handwriting. In other words, all 3 documents were not just copies of some strange piece of paper. They had clearly passed through Diddy's own hands. Not only had he seen them, but he had personally made corrections, underlined the parts he wanted, and left a symbol that, according to some witnesses, had sacred meaning. When the prosecutor seized the moment and asked Jada if she recognized the symbol, an eye in a circle, she did not hesitate. She calmly nodded and said that she had seen it on the document that night at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel. According to her, Diddy himself explained to her that the symbol meant guardian, that it guards the mission and punishes traitors. It sounded strange, almost mystical. But given the circumstances, the dimly lit room, the champagne, the pre-prepared document with her signature printed on it, it all took on a sinister and frightening meaning. Diddy's lawyers immediately sprang into action. They claimed that all the documents were forged, that the women had colluded, and that the prosecution was deliberately selecting hysterical stars to discredit their client. They called the situation psychological theater and accused the prosecution of trying to put on a show rather than conducting a legally sound case. However, the judge was completely unimpressed. He calmly listened to both sides, then laid out copies of all 3 documents in front of him, leafed through them, pausing at the identical notes, and said that at this stage it was premature to talk about coincidence or conspiracy. There were too many recurring elements in the testimonies of 3 different women. There were too many details that matched, down to phrases and symbols. And the conclusion of the handwriting expert, who confirmed that all the notes were made by the defendant himself, was no longer hearsay, but direct evidence. The judge ruled that the case required further investigation and that he did not intend to dismiss the documents as requested by the defense. From that moment on, the case moved from the realm of dubious rumors to the realm of material evidence, expert opinions, and documents written by Diddy himself. And now that the truth was beginning to emerge on paper, it was impossible to ignore, even for the most ardent defenders of silence. When the third contract was read out, the atmosphere in the courtroom became almost unbearable. The tension was palpable. One of the spectators sitting in the back row fainted and had to be carried out, and the judge called for a recess. This was no longer just a trial against a famous producer. It began to resemble the exposure of something far more sinister, a system resembling a closed sect, carefully disguised as charitable foundations, creative collaborations, and parties for their own. Jada Pinkett Smith continued to testify calmly, without hysterics, but her words were memorable. She spoke of a structure built on fear, coercion, and total control. According to her, the system that Diddy had built around himself did not tolerate disobedience. Everything worked on the principle: if you want to be part of the elite, obey, keep quiet, and do what you are told. If you disagree, you either disappear or are squeezed out of the industry. Jada admitted that over the years she had developed a reflex to avoid certain people, parties, and meetings, especially those where Diddy's name came up. And it wasn't about gossip, but experience. She knew how another innocent invitation to a lavish party could end. She explained that Hollywood has its own unspoken calendar of such events, and if Diddy is on the list, it means that things will not be so simple. It's not just a party with cocktails and a DJ. There is an internal system at work. Code words, special invitations, and a clear script. Jada gave examples of phrases used by assistants and organizers: room upstairs, midnight, circle, bring your aura. It sounds mysterious, almost silly, but those in the know understood that it wasn't about music or dancing. It was an invitation to the so-called network, which Jada spoke about with particular caution. A network that, according to her, Diddy had been building for years and controlled personally. She emphasized that she wasn't the only one who was asked to join, but she was one of the few who refused and remained sane. At the same time, she didn't pretend to be a heroine. She honestly admitted that she was afraid, had doubts many times, and often regretted not saying yes because it would have opened many doors for her. But every time she had to choose between her career and her freedom, she chose the latter. At one point, she even began to quietly warn others: young actresses, aspiring singers, those who were just about to go to their first party with the big shots. But it was impossible to say everything directly. It was too dangerous. Sometimes people listened to her, sometimes they didn't. And some of those who didn't believe her simply disappeared. They stopped communicating, deleted their accounts, turned down roles, lost contracts, or simply vanished from public life without a trace. According to Jada, no one spoke about it directly. Everyone just understood. And if they didn't understand, they found out later when it was too late. And now, years later, when the process has begun, she has decided that it is time to break her silence. Because, as she said in court, silence has been the main tool of defense for the guilty for too long. Jada spoke in detail about how many other people in the industry had also faced similar offers. They were like secret deals, disguised as mutually beneficial cooperation. In exchange for complete loyalty and a promise to remain silent, they were promised access to the most elite opportunities: roles in films, contracts, invitations to private events. But behind this, there was always a hidden threat, as if it wasn't just a choice, but a trap from which it was difficult to escape without consequences. During her testimony, Diddy's face changed before our eyes. At first, he looked cold and indifferent, as if nothing was happening. But when Jada began reading excerpts from documents and quoting his own words, he became visibly tense. He began to fidget, tremble, and avoid looking at her or the jury. For the first time during the trial, it became apparent that his defense had cracked. This moment clearly threw him off balance. His reaction was particularly noticeable when Jada uttered a phrase he had once said to her personally: "You'll regret this in the next life." At that moment, the cameras captured Diddy's gaze darkening and his expression becoming anxious, as if he truly felt he was being pursued, not just by the judges and jury, but by something far more sinister and intangible. When Jada finished her testimony, the courtroom erupted with tension. People sat stunned, and the actress's words quickly spread across social media and the news. Headlines instantly framed the story as a silence breaker and the revelation of a dark, hidden side of Diddy himself. Many celebrities, fearing the consequences, were reluctant to speak openly. But it was now clear that rumors of such a network in Hollywood had been circulating for a long time, and no one had dared to bring them to light until Jada took the first step. After Jada's court appearance, the reaction in the music and entertainment industry was almost immediate, but not always open. Everything happened quietly, almost in whispers, but with palpable force. According to rumors, some of the most influential women in the music business, including Beyoncé herself and her sister Solange Knowles, began to gather for closed, strictly confidential meetings. At these meetings, they discussed the evidence and warnings that Jada had voiced in court. Jada advised them not to agree to any proposals related to so-called loyalty agreements or Diddy's mysterious legacy. According to her, once you are drawn into this system, there is no way out. You find yourself under absolute control, which affects not only your career but also your personal freedom. She recommended literally walking away from such situations immediately, without looking back or trying to explain your decision, because any delay or hesitation could have serious consequences. Jada explained in detail that Diddy sees himself as a figure above the rules and laws. He doesn't need consent or approval from anyone. All that matters to him is control over those associated with him. Refusal is not simply a rejection of an individual. It is a challenge to an entire system that operates on fear, silence, and oppression. For Diddy, such a no means confrontation with something much darker and more powerful, something that is not easy to survive. Soon after the trial, the real consequences began. Not only law enforcement agencies, but also major music companies, agents, and production studios began investigations. They started checking contracts for signs of coercion or hidden conditions that could restrict artists' freedom. Music streaming services around the world began removing songs and albums by artists closely associated with Diddy and his entourage from their playlist to distance themselves from the scandal. Many major fashion brands also refused to participate in advertising campaigns that mentioned or featured Diddy, fearing associations with negative publicity. Jada herself stopped giving interviews, preferring to let her words and actions speak for her. But her courage sparked a chain reaction. Many celebrities who had previously been afraid to step out of the shadows began to open up and share their stories. New evidence emerged, confirming the existence of an unofficial network of control and pressure within the industry. In response to all this, the judge ordered a full, comprehensive investigation to get to the bottom of the matter and reveal the extent of the problem. A new era dawned in the entertainment industry. Now no one could ignore this story or turn a blind eye to it. Everyone understood that the situation was serious and required change. And it was not just individual figures who came under scrutiny, but the entire system that had long hidden its dark side behind a glossy facade.